All right, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's workshop, which is Making Thinking Visible in an AI-Rich Learning Environment. I'm Emily Rush. I'm an AI Education Specialist for Academic Affairs and also AI Discipline Director for the Medical College. Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So happy you're joining us today. I'm Laura. I am a senior instructional designer at City.
Great, thanks, Laura. Okay, so a little bit about today's workshop. What we're going to do today is, well, just a little bit about how this workshop evolved. So today's session grew out of questions that we often hear from faculty and in other discussions about how do we know if students are using AI appropriately, and how do we understand their reasoning and judgment when AI is part of the process. We will be the first to admit that these are not easy questions to answer, and we're not going to pretend that we have all the answers, but we aren't going to just leave you with questions. So in terms of the structure of today's workshop, what we're going to do initially is sort of frame the problem and outline a little bit about why AI in teaching creates design tensions and why there isn't a single fix, but we will talk about some possible solutions. We're next going to look at the evidence for what we know about how students use AI, what do we know about AI disclosure practices, and how students respond to transparency expectations based on some of the evidence that we have from scholarship. And then we're going to explore some possible design responses, both in regard to transparency and also trying to tease out or elicit reflection and metacognition from students, so we get a sense of how AI is influencing their thinking.
Emily, so here are our learning objectives for today. We have 5. First, we're going to identify common decision points related to transparency, evidence of learning, and AI use in health sciences teaching contexts. We'll distinguish between transparency practices that support student reasoning and those that primarily increase documentation, or what we'll call interpretive burden or interpretive load. Consider what forms of evidence most meaningfully reveal student thinking in AI-rich learning environments. And examine lightweight metacognitive prompts that can support student reflection and judgment without increasing faculty workload. Lastly, articulate reasonable, and that's a key word here, and sustainable expectations for student AI use based on professional judgment and teaching context.
All right, now one of the things we want to do to situate our workshop is to return to a framing that we used a couple of months ago for a workshop on AI assessment. So we're going back to this idea of wicked problems. And if you weren't able to join us for that workshop, I'll contextualize it a little bit. So the framing comes around this idea of a wicked problem, and this is actually a phrase or I guess a theoretical anchoring borrowed from design and policy thinking. And so it describes certain problems as being complex, shifting, and resistant to permanent fixes. And so in a previous workshop, we talked about AI and assessment as fitting that definition rather precisely. And so we're turning to that framing a little bit today just as kind of a theoretical anchoring. So in terms of AI and assessment as a wicked problem, we see that when AI enters the equation into student assessment, we start to see competing values emerging. So how do we look at learning, integrity, efficiency, access, and fairness? And sometimes these don't all align perfectly. We often see unstable or competing conditions around things like tool use, institutional expectations and norms, and especially how those continue to shift as technology evolves. And then what makes this essentially a wicked problem is that for many of these issues, there isn't a single right answer, so that faculty are often forced to sort of cope or adapt with the shifting landscape and to make decisions under uncertainty, and often having to prioritize one tension or problem over the other. All right. Now, with that frame in mind, what we want to do briefly is just look at where students are likely to be in terms of their AI use. And this is a little bit dated. I've actually been having trouble finding any 2026 surveys on AI use. So this is a survey from July 2025 from Inside Higher Ed and Generation Lab, and it surveyed over 1,000 students at over 160 US institutions, and these are 2 and 4 year institutions. So it's an approximation, of course, for our students here at Rush. But what this survey found is that 85% of college students report using AI for some form of coursework. Now, within that survey, the students who were willing to disclose their AI use predominantly indicated that they were using AI for tasks like brainstorming, for tutors, or for studying for exams. So I think we will take that as a foundation for the belief that AI use is relatively widespread by students. I think it's also not unreasonable to surmise that students are very likely using AI for writing in their courses. So that's sort of another point of framing or anchoring that we want to bring to today's discussion is that a large percentage of our students are very likely using AI. And so as such, as we move forward with today's discussion, we want to think about how do we make design decisions with that in mind? And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Thanks, Emily. So before we move into frameworks and strategies and proposed solutions, we want to begin by grounding this session in your actual teaching experiences. As you know, expectations around AI, transparency and disclosure and AI altogether are evolving quickly, and the landscape is constantly changing. And many faculty like yourself are making decisions about what to require, what to permit, and what actually helps you understand student learning. So while we do that, as Emily mentioned, tensions arise. And so this discussion question is meant to surface where that tension is most visible in your own courses. And I'll read the question here. Where have expectations around AI transparency or disclosure become most uncertain in your teaching? Feel free to respond verbally in the chat. We'd love to hear from you particular examples or just questions or concerns you have about transparency and AI transparency and disclosure. So as you ponder this, you might consider how you framed AI use and disclosure in your assignments and how students have interpreted that, or perhaps how this has affected you and your students' workloads, a number of ways you might approach answering these questions. Feel free to just unmute or throw it in the chat, however you'd like to respond.
So thank you all again for that rich conversation. What we want to do is think about 4 possible lenses for exploring AI use with regard to transparency, sort of evidence of student thinking and reasoning, and as a tool for prompting metacognition. And the transparency conversation behind the scenes, Laura and I were sort of talking about, I should have put it in the chat, but Wiley has recently introduced publisher guidelines for AI use, and they are really excessive for the way that authors have to disclose AI in their writing process. So it got us to thinking about what does transparency look like in a spectrum of utility versus becoming overly burdensome. So the first lens is thinking a little bit about transparency in terms of what do we ask for students to show how AI is supporting their learning, and when does it sort of become excessive and become performative? So those are some questions or tensions we want to think about. And a question that we would pose to you all to think about is, what is the level of transparency that you would want to feel confident in your students' learning? That closely relates to the issue of evidence or the topic of evidence. So what kind of evidence is useful for you in thinking about a student's reflective processes or critical reasoning processes? And we saw in the chat some of the things that faculty are asking in terms of evidence for student learning. And so one of the things that we might want to think about in this workshop is the kinds of evidence we're asking students to provide and why we're asking that. In terms of reasonableness, what are expectations around AI and what seems feasible to sustain in the long term? And finally, metacognition. So, and this is something that we'll talk about a little more extensively later on in today's session, but how can we build these sort of useful pauses into the process of AI use in which students engage in reflection? So how can reflection uh, be useful or a different form of documentation of student AI use? And questions about what do we wish we knew more about how students were using AI. So those will surface a little bit more as the workshop progresses. All right, to continue grounding this and to set us up for additional parts of the conversation, what we want to do is introduce a concept that resonated with both of us as we were preparing for today, and that's this idea of interpretive load. And here we're looking at the article reference on the bottom of the screen. So interpretive load is the effort that's required by students to understand or interpret what's expected of them with regard to a task before they can actually engage in the learning process itself. And as you can imagine, with the introduction of AI into the educational landscape, this does become complex because each task may be sort of a negotiation process in which students need to think about what counts as AI use, and Laura will say a little bit more about, the sort of juggling act that students might go to when they're thinking about what constitutes AI use. They might think about, as some of you have indicated in the chat, what should be disclosed. Do we disclose every single AI interaction, or are there only select interactions that we would want students to disclose? And how much detail do we want? So some of you in the chat noted that you might just ask students to reference the use of a particular model. Maybe some of you ask them to give you the prompt, whereas others might want more detailed information about AI use. And then there's also the uncertainty that students have around how will their disclosure be interpreted. If students use AI, are they afraid that they might be judged for that? So the sort of takeaway for this article that I want to highlight before I turn over the presentation to Laura is that transparency, and here I'm talking about transparency from the student perspective, is that it is helpful when it reduces uncertainty. Obviously, faculty may have a different perspective surrounding transparency.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks. Awesome. So as Emily was discussing, just despite our best efforts to model transparent use or transparent AI use and require that students disclose their own use, as some of you have shared, and as several recent studies have shown, many students are not complying, or sometimes we just don't know if they're complying or if they're using and not complying. So there are lots of reasons for that, some of which I'm sure you're all aware of, but today we'll focus on a few I've listed here. Now, these include privacy concerns. For example, sharing chat logs as a part of an assignment submission. Students have reported concerns, particularly in the study that Emily previously shared, concerns about sharing what they regard as private interactions that could reveal their developing understanding of a topic. In fact, some have reported that doing so feels invasive. And I've included a couple of possible reactions to that to the right of the concern here. The next is stigmatization and informal penalization. As we know, this is an evolving technology, and expectations and perceptions around AI use are unclear and sometimes polarizing. Many students may feel stigmatized by faculty if they report AI use. And in fact, some studies have recently suggested that women or female students and students of color may be even less willing to disclose AI use. There may be fears among multiple different users of being perceived as lazy or incompetent, and these may accompany some of these concerns. And as Emily discussed, with AI tools becoming so seamlessly integrated into our workflows, it can be particularly difficult for students to know what to declare. For example, they might wonder if they used Grammarly AI to help them edit their writing, edit their grammar in their writing. Should they disclose that? And this can be further complicated if the assignment, task description, and evaluation criteria are vague or unclear. And there's that concept of interpretive load again. If we're just saying state AI use or AI use disclosure, it may increase students' interpretive load of trying to determine what constitutes that use. Lastly, inconsistent policies and procedures. And this is something that, may be out of our control to a degree. With many faculty and programs adopting their own policies, it can be difficult for students to know if and how they should disclose AI use when there are varying expectations across, say, their coursework or a college or university. A student could ask any number or have any number of these reactions that you see here on the right. So just a caveat that overall disclosure policies alone do not necessarily guarantee meaningful transparency or adopting disclosure policies, right? So applying design responses that we'll talk about in a moment can help to mitigate some of these issues, as it does offer some more accessible guidelines for AI use and evaluation. However, some of the reasons that students do not disclose could exceed the scope of our control in our classrooms, and I think should be considered when adopting and enforcing any AI disclosure guidelines. Next slide, please, Emily. This may be yours.
Yeah. Okay. So before we will very shortly, we will move into some more concrete suggestions about how to navigate these issues. But before we do that, I just wanted to bring up some of the tensions that we see at play as we're thinking about issues of transparency, concerns about student offloading or over-reliance on AI. These are sort of an amalgamation of issues that come to the forefront when we think about how AI enters into the teaching and learning process. So some of the tensions that we need to navigate, and we will try to do so in the next few slides, are thinking about, first of all, how do we make thinking visible in the teaching and learning process, and what does that look like in an assessment in which AI has played a role? We'll give some suggestions shortly, but some of the tensions that emerge are, how do we do that without creating undue documentation for the student or for the faculty member to have to navigate? And the risk is that the burden of proof becomes unwieldy or unnecessary, or we ask students to create documentation that is not necessarily used or is just sort of held in reserve for just in case. On the other hand, some goals in terms of designing for an AI-rich learning environment is, how can we think about designing assessments that support reflection? On the one hand, if AI is part of the process, there is a risk of potential over-reliance on AI or risk of tool dependence. And then lastly, there's the issue Laura has been talking about, especially, is what do expectations look like around AI use, and the difficulty of navigating that. So on the one hand, there is a tension or risk of creating demands that become excessive or burdensome, and in the long term become unsustainable.
Thanks, Emily. So we're asking a lot of questions. We realized as we were designing this workshop, it's like, wow, we have so many questions, right? And relatively not as many answers, but that's the nature of this wicked problem, right? But yet I pose to you another question. That question becomes then, how do we design these assignments that acknowledge these tensions without increasing workload or uncertainty? And the million-dollar question, right? And how do we best determine to what degree transparency is necessary for any given assignment? This is one of my sort of favorite approaches because it's immediately accessible, not necessarily, as any of these are, a one-stop solution for this thorny problem. But anyone familiar with the TILT framework? Show of hands if you are, or in the chat, love to hear about that. It is something like 13 years old now. It is a framework developed by Marianne Winkel. I think I've hopefully pronounced her last name correctly, originally in 2013. And this is meant to be a kind of foundational rethinking before we get into like specific design responses. But the tilt framework is a sort of a foundational design approach that's adaptable to any number of contexts, and particularly to the current moment of teaching and learning with AI. Interestingly, the author developed it as a tool for equity. It was designed as a small but impactful and ultimately equitable teaching intervention designed to support students, particularly among historically underachieving and underserved students. And it focuses primarily on assignment design and following sort of three simple design elements. One, defining the purpose. Two, articulating the task or set of tasks. And three, communicating the criteria for success. So this table here provides you with a series of questions you can ask when revising your assignments using the framework. And a well-designed assignment should include answers to most or all of these questions. And so we've adapted them here for the AI context, though it wasn't originally envisioned in the context of AI. So, for example, defining the purpose as you're revising your assignment using that framework, you might ask yourself, what skills will students practice and what knowledge will they gain? And communicating that to your students in the purpose of the assignment. How does it connect to the course, career, and lives? And Wincom was very emphatic about making meaningful and authentic connections when articulating the purpose. Why, and in the case of AI, why are we using AI to complete the assignment, and how will AI support the learning goals? The answers to these questions ideally should be communicated in the purpose section of that assignment rethinking. Next, you would articulate the tasks. So simply, what do you expect students to do and how will they do it? And in the context of AI, what tasks should be communicated with and without the use of AI? How should students use AI to complete the task? What resources are provided? What evidence of AI use is required? And also, how will you offer flexibility and choice or alternatives to AI? Some students elect to opt out of AI use for any number of reasons, whether they be ethical or equity concerns. So it is important to consider, and it is a UDL best practice to consider alternatives to AI use if in fact that is a required component of your assignment. And then lastly, communicating the criteria. How will student work be evaluated? What are the criteria for a successful submission? We've often advocated for the use of student exemplars or examples of work that meet expectations. So in the context of AI, you may include exemplars of how AI was integrated in an assignment submission, or perhaps examples of prompts that were effective, modeling those for your students, and also considering how the grading rubric may need to be modified to include AI and how you will assess that. That would also be an important step in that tilt redesign of your assignment. So overall, tilt helps students understand not only what to do, but how they'll be evaluated. It's really intended to be a very sort of accessible and simple approach to designing an assignment that helps to decrease that interpretive load for students, so they know exactly what the tasks are, exactly how to do those tasks, and how they'll be evaluated on them. And as you would imagine, it's best introduced, right, or accompanied by a faculty introduction to the assignment and an opportunity for students to discuss and bring up potential issues or barriers that might make it difficult for them to satisfy those expectations well before the assignment is due. That can also be a good opportunity for faculty to model use and, how AI, the potential barriers and opportunities when using AI to complete a particular assignment. Now, this is a pretty lengthy framework, or can be. I'm not saying that this needs to be done for every assignment, right? Weekly quizzes or weekly discussions, it may not be appropriate to have a full tilt framework for that. But especially for assignments that require extended time, such as a summative assessment that is scaffolded and requires multiple steps, applying this framework can be particularly useful. And I think I'm done there. If you have questions, or I know we're talking at you a lot, so please feel free to raise your hand or throw questions in the chat as we go. So if tilt is a foundational approach, we can now move on to smaller, more lightweight design responses. And before we discuss broader assignment redesign, it can be helpful to consider the smallest possible design adjustment. And so one of those options is simply building AI awareness or routine awareness of AI use into coursework. I know many of you already do that. I think Clayton was one of a few that said that he requires that AI disclosure in his assignment guidelines. But at an awareness level, we're not asking students to provide their thinking or reflect on their use or submit transcripts. We're simply helping them sort of develop professional habits of acknowledging when AI is part of their workflow. So this might look like a short statement in an assignment, a checkbox, perhaps as a part of a Canvas survey, or a brief note in a case write-up, for example. You could ask them to share the prompt they use if appropriate, if in fact it helps to support their learning goals. And that too could be part of a simple declaration. So the goal is sort of normalization and transparency, making AI disclosure a standard practice. And this is not unlike AI use disclosures in professional practice. And next slide, please. Thank you, Emily. Sorry, just getting my notes here. So once assignments are transparent in purpose, task, and criteria, and AI use is consistently declared, we can be more selective about what kinds of AI transparency we actually require and how these expectations are aligned with student learning objectives. So in many cases, asking students to document every prompt or interaction increases workload without improving or understanding of if and how our students met their learning goals. And instead, we could use brief targeted prompts that surface thinking. For example, a prompt like, where did AI influence your thinking and what did you change? And so this type of question encourages students to evaluate AI output, describe judgment, and show revision. And to me, it also reduces interpretive burden for both students and faculty. In this case, you may not even need students to share evidence of their engagement, say submitting a chat log, if it's not necessary for the sake of the assignment. For example, I've found prompts like this in my own teaching to be particularly useful for, say, discussions posts or short reflection essays at the end of a summative assignment or something. But the broader takeaway is that transparency should be purposeful and aligned with learning goals and not just exhaustive for its own sake. And that's a theme that we'll return to repeatedly throughout the presentation. Thanks, Emily.
All right, and again, I encourage you all to please unmute yourselves if you have questions or comments, or put content in the chat, because we'd love to hear from you. I know we've been talking a lot. One of the things that what Laura was mentioned, and something that came up in our own conversations as we were preparing for the workshop, is what our own AI use practices look like and what reflection around that looks like. And this is just an anecdote, is that I've seen from scholars and bloggers who are writing about AI use are noting and reflecting a lot on their own practices, in which we see people emerging that are now, we used to think about using one single AI system or LLM at a time and one chat at a time. And just this past week, I've seen a lot of people talking about having sort of simultaneous chats going with ChatGPT and Claude, and what that looks like to engage with multiple systems simultaneously, and how that influences our work and thought processes. It's a little bit digressive, but I guess it leads me to where I wanted to go now, is to thinking about what does a reflection process look like for AI use? So this is sort of taking this transparency to the next step. Transparency might just be about disclosure. So reflection is really try to invite that pause into the process to think about how am I using AI and how is it impacting my thinking or workflow? And so what I'm presenting here is I think basically it could be used as a template that could be adapted for a variety of course contexts or teaching contexts. And like I said, the basic goal is really to have students pause at different stages of their interaction process with large language models. So ideally, before just turning to your computer or phone or whatever and using AI, that we might pause to think about before I put something into the large language model, what do I already know? What am I unsure about? And what do I think a good answer would need to include? So I'm primed to evaluate the content before the large language model puts it out. During the process, we may be reading the LLM output and we want to think about what does the large language model accomplish well. And a couple of you in the discussion portion noticed that in your own domains that ChatGPT, for example, is doing some things really well and some places it's still struggling. And so you are engaging with these processes. These are questions that you or your students might ask about where does the AI oversimplify or mix context, or where does it hallucinate if they're able to identify that? And what content do I need to verify? That's a key question that I think we want students, whenever they engage with large language models for course purposes, is to think about what content do I need to verify and what does a verification look like? And then afterwards, as part of this reflection process, is what did I change as a result of my AI interaction and what do I now understand better? Um, I think that this is a model that could be used at any level of formality, either in a verbal exchange or as part of a written assignment, just as a sort of very short addendum to any task, basically. And what I want to do now is show just sort of an alternative that's a little bit more formal. This is something that is adapted from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign's graduate program in education. This is something that for their course written papers that students are required to do an additional short written reflection regarding their AI use. And so as part of the assignment, students have to think about how they used AI for their task and try to identify patterns in their thinking and decision making as they pertain to AI use. As you can see on the screen, students are asked to write about things like how did you decide, when and how did you decide to use AI? So to try and document that thought process or the rationale for AI use. To try and pinpoint what is the role of AI play at different points in your research and writing process, and how did you evaluate or refine AI generated responses? If you're thinking about this as maybe a course paper or something like that, how does your approach to AI use change over time? And what would you do differently? So ways to think about how does AI use evolve as part of professional practice? So those are just sort of two models of what AI structured reflection and AI use to promote metacognition might look like. What I'm going to do briefly is switch to a different way of thinking about AI use and how we look for evidence and thinking. And that is instead of looking at the AI output, what we do instead is looking at the AI input. So essentially student prompts. And I'll expand on this slide and the next slide. The first is to explain why we would bother to look at student AI prompts instead of the output. And then I'll talk a little bit more about what the results might look like. And I should say that this derives from an educator by the name of Mike Kentz. He has developed this line of thinking that in an environment when AI use is so pervasive, one of the things that's beneficial for looking for evidence of students thinking is to quote grade the chats, which sounds a little bit alarming and burdensome. But the goal, I think, here is that we're not necessarily scrutinizing the AI output. We're looking very carefully at the inputs or the prompts. So if we're looking just at student prompts in a specific AI interaction, we might do things like try to assess how well did a student define the task or need in their prompt. Did the students break down the problem into different parts, or how did they address the problem? Because the way they articulate it in the prompt shows a little bit about their thinking and writing process. If the the interaction with the large language model is iterative, we can look at the interactions again, just looking at the prompts or the inputs and thinking about, do the subsequent student replies show critical assessment of the output, or are they just asking the large language model continue explaining or explain more? And I would suggest that the continued engagement that we see in the prompts shows a little bit about their thinking process. And likewise, is there any evidence in the student prompt interactions with the large language models to show that the student revised their thinking? Or conversely, did they redirect the large language model if it seemed like it was going off track? Or did they do anything to change the interaction? So the big question here in terms of looking at chats is thinking about how student engagement with large language models reveals process that might not be reflected in the end product, and what that shows about their thinking. All right, so in terms of reframing the value of the prompt, and here I'm not talking about technical or highly structured prompts according to prompt recipes or prompt frameworks that have been very popular over the past few years. Instead, I'm just trying to suggest that we might look at the prompt to think about their thinking or framing of a particular issue. And so as this sort of, it's a little bit simplistic, but we'll go with it. If we look at the comparison of student A versus student B and a possible form of engagement with a large language model. So on the one hand, if student A asks, what are the symptoms of sepsis? That's asking for sort of a lower level of information. Whereas if we look at prompt B, the student says, my patient has a fever, elevated lactate, and altered mental status. Help me think through whether this meets sepsis criteria and what I'm missing. So here we see that the student has already sort of assembled diverse points of information as part of the prompt. And it's also essentially asking the large language model to take on a role of a guide or tutor. So I think this is one possible example of how we can look at student prompt use as evidence of their thinking and engagement with large language models. Just checking the chat and seeing if there's anything we want to bring up. Okay, not right now. Okay, the last one, this is the one that is the most experimental, but it's the one I'm most excited about. So previously I've been talking a little bit about what thinking looks like possibly within single AI interactions. What I'm going to do now is suggest that there's also especially the possibility for certain course assignments or a series of interactions to look at how students interact with AI over a broader project or over a broad duration of time. And this also comes from a place from my academic research. I'm a qualitative researcher who's very much interested in the use of AI for teaching, learning, and research. And so this was inspired by the work of a linguistics scholar who works in corpus linguistics. And unfortunately, I couldn't track down the reference because it was an informal post from a few years ago, but it was something that really stuck with me. And so bear with me as I explain this. But basically, the idea was that this is a corpus linguistics scholar who described experiments of documenting her own AI use by downloading, actually, at that point, I think all of her chat interfaces. So something like 1,300 chat interfaces, which is not at all what I'm suggesting you do. I'm just contextualizing it. But she downloaded them all, synthesized them, uploaded them to AI, and had the AI analyze the patterns in interaction. And so what intrigued me was the idea that we could do this on a much smaller scale with students. And I'll go through in a couple slides what scaling this interaction might look like. But the idea behind that context is that we could look at a series of AI interactions over a duration of time, like if a student is preparing a capstone project or a research project or research paper, and analyze these series of interactions to identify patterns in students' thinking and decision making over time. Um, some of the why I think that this could be beneficial in terms of thinking about how students can transparently disclose their AI use as they might do in their paper, but that doesn't necessarily show us how AI influences their final product. So this is a different way of getting at that. Um, this also could just provide students with an opportunity to have more structured opportunities to think about how they use AI, I guess. Right. So what this might look like in practice is that you ask your students to select a particular number of interactions from a task or project, and this would be relevant to probably the weight or magnitude of the project for your course. And they would download or copy those interactions into a document, or there are chat libraries where you can store your chats. And what you would do is then put them through a large language model and prompt the large language model to help you identify patterns in those interactions. And I'll show you a possible prompt in just a minute. The end goal is that both the LLM and the student can then identify patterns in the interactions, and the student can ultimately think about the extent to which the AI was involved in the process or task and how their thinking hopefully evolved over time. So if I downloaded all of my prompts for a particular project or paper and pulled them all together, I could use ChatGPT or Claude. Gemini would work really well because it has large context window. And I would ask it to, for example, analyze the following interactions and help me identify patterns in terms of how I framed questions, how did I evaluate responses, and how did I revise my thinking. That's one possible prompt that we could use to start to synthesize our AI interactions and uh, look for patterns over time, I guess. All right. Now, in thinking about how this would play out in reality, I think that this could work well in a variety of contexts and it could be scaled. So for a shorter assignment or task, one might start on the left and ask for an individual assignment or a short activity for students to do a focused reflection and ask them to use AI to help them analyze, for example, 3 to 5 interactions and then respond to a few reflection prompts. And I do have some of those on a following slide. And then maybe they write a short paragraph or so reflecting on what they've learned from this additional portion of their research or assessment task. Um, I think what becomes visible in this process is we start to think about bring to light how students might frame problems and what are some of their initial reasoning as they attempt to complete a task. And the particular benefit is that this is something that we're asking students to do. It's not something you're doing yourself. We could scale this up a little bit and do a broader pattern analysis. So look at case-based or multiple step assignments and ask your learners to select 8 to 10 excerpts. And then again, identify patterns with AI support. Similarly, write a reflection and evaluate AI responses. And this could scale all the way up to a thesis or capstone project in which learners work from a larger bounded corpus, and within that corpus, they identify patterns across their work and critically evaluate that. Now, as part of the culmination of this, again, there would be the AI interaction, and then there's the component in which students would either individually reflect on the AI output and summation and analysis of their work, or depending on what you permit, they could also use AI to do things like help them answer these questions about what patterns they've identified, how have they evaluated AI challenges or responses, and I think especially the metacognitive component. So looking at once they've used AI to sort of synthesize their body of work and they've had a chance to reflect on it, they would think about what do these interactions reveal about how you work with the large language model and how do you make decisions when using AI. When you use AI, what does that look like? When do you rely on it? And when do you try to move beyond that? And what would you do differently? So again, this is sort of an experimental way of thinking about using AI, and I think in a novel way that could enhance not just transparency, but reflection and metacognition. All right. I know I put a lot of ideas out there that sort of range from the small scale. So thinking about that three steps about when I use AI, what do I think about before AI use, while I'm using AI, and after, to sort of the broad scale corpus analysis. So it is quite of a range of what one might do in terms of bringing AI more into the conversation and reflecting on AI use. But I think the key thing that we want to emphasize as we think about all of these is that the goal is not to try and capture every single interaction because that becomes exhaustive for you and it becomes exhaustive for your students, but to try and think about how we can adapt some of these suggestions in ways that make students more thoughtful about their decision making processes and how those processes can be more visible to you all. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand over the conversation back to Laura.
Yeah, and I think, Emily, your last slide really, I think, encapsulated a lot of what I wanted to say here. So I won't elaborate on this too much because I think I want to make sure we have enough time for people to chat. And Ramona had a good question in the chat that a faculty would also appreciate. So just as a reminder, right, that we've been talking about this kind of these differing approaches to AI disclosure and transparency. And just again, to emphasize, as Emily said, it's not a single policy decision, but a decision that varies by context and according to your students' learning needs. And different assignments may require different levels of transparency. Which, yeah, I think we'll sort of wrap that up here and move on to discussion.